Good morning, everyone. My name is Maxine. I'm extremely excited to be with you guys this morning to talk about understanding cancer metastases. So just to give a little roadmap of what I'll be talking about today. So I'll talk about what is cancer metastases, understanding the metastatic process, understanding that metastases is complicated, and how we study metastases in the lab. And so as Rachel said, I am a cancer researcher, so the majority of my work is done in the lab at the bench and working with different models to try to understand cancer metastases. And I know we'll have a lot of time for questions and responses at the end after Dr. Carr speaks. So what is metastases? You may hear the word metastases or metastasize or metastatic. And so what that really means is it's the development of a secondary tumor at a distance from the primary site of cancer, also known as the primary tumor. It also means the spread to other sites in the body by metastasis. So in this case, we're using that word as an action or process, that something is occurring by metastasis. And so hopefully here you can see in my figure, here is a breast tumor or breast cancer, or in this case, we'll call it the primary tumor, so the original site. And the arrows indicate the potential spread or metastasis of these tumor cells. And here, these arrows, what I hope you can see, are ways in which tumor cells can actually spread or metastasize through the body. So we take a quick step back. I want to introduce two foundational principles that are really important in cancer biology to help you understand metastases. So the first principle is that cancer develops in stages. So it doesn't happen necessarily overnight. It's a process that takes time, as well as the fact that cells like to move. So both normal, healthy cells and cancer cells love to move around. So let's dig in a little bit more into the fact that cancer develops in stages. So when you have a tissue, it could be the breast, liver, and ovary, it's going to be contained within the tissue walls. And you can see on the sort of inside where the arrow is pointing, it's the outside with the tissue walls, and it's lined with cells. And so when cancer begins to happen, what you'll have is those cells begin to divide or multiply way too much. They don't stop. And so you'll see those cells growing. And then the next part is those cells will continue to grow and their shape will change and they'll begin to look abnormal. They no longer look like healthy cells. And then they continue to grow. And at this point, it's pretty clear that it's likely cancer. But what's important about this stage is that those cells are still contained within the tissue wall. And the last step is when those cells begin to break out. You can see now there's cells on the outside of that tissue wall. So that indicates that that cancer is now what we would say invasive. It's breaking past the bounds of that tissue. And so let's think about the second principle, the fact that cells like to move. And so one of the terms we often use in cancer biology is cell migration. And so you might be familiar with the word migration. So it means in the case with cells, the directed movement of either a single cell or a group of cells together going somewhere. And also another important term that we like to use in cancer biology is called cell invasion. So this is very similar to migration, but the difference is instead of the cell just going from one point to the other, it's the ability of a cell to actually move through something. So in this case, maybe through a tissue, it's going through the cell walls. And so in my cartoon, it's sort of like if your cell was going through Jell-O. So it's not just passing by it, but it's actually going through it. So those are two terms that are really important, both migration and invasion, when we talk about cancer metastases. So this is a video I wanted to show you guys of cells actually moving. And so you can see right here, hopefully you can see that on your screen, the cells actually moving and crawling around on this Petri dish. So you can see the cells from now at the bottom kind of moving around. And this is a really cool video that I also enjoy where you can see that the cells actually move together in groups, and you can almost see them crawling, almost like they have little feet that extend and they kind of drag themselves forward. So this is often how cells move in Petri dishes as well as in your body. So they move together as well as forward. So let's talk about the metastatic process. So I mentioned that at the beginning, that cancer happens in stages, and so does metastases. So let's start with the fact that you have a primary tumor, that first tumor. That tumor is going to grow and multiply, just like we talked about at the beginning. And eventually it's going to invade past the tissue walls, or this is known as invasion. Remember, invasion is cells going through something. So in this case, it's going through the tissue wall. Those cells can actually go into the bloodstream, so actually squeeze their way into blood vessels. And actually, this is very harsh on cells. Most cells will not survive this process. They can die because they try to squeeze through those blood vessels. They can die because they're unattached to each other, or they hit those blood vessel walls as they're sort of bouncing around. Or oftentimes immune cells, which are sort of your fighting cells, will come in and attack and kill those cancer cells. But the ones that do survive through this process can actually come out of the bloodstream and sort of find a new home, a new place to hang out. And they start as a small tumor, which we call a micrometastases. And then again, it will grow and multiply until it becomes a macrometastases, or a very large tumor. And that is how we get the process of starting with a primary tumor that then spreads to a second site. So when we're thinking about metastases, we would say, okay, cancer develops in stages. And if we combine this with the fact that cells like to move, this is really how we get to metastases happening. So you may have a lot of questions like, why don't you just stop the process of metastases? Is there a test for metastases? When is it going to actually occur? Why don't we just treat the cells before they get there? Or a very common one is, someone has a breast cancer, and for one person it metastasizes to the brain, but another person it metastasizes to the lung. Why two different spots? So the truth is that metastases is actually a very complicated process. It's as complicated as trying to predict my shopping patterns. And it might not make sense, but I promise you that it will. So let's say I'm at home, and the first question you might ask yourself is, am I going to leave my house? Well, that's probably dependent on quite a few factors. Do I have work? Do I have my kids? Do I need to go to the store? So let's say, yes, I'm going to leave my house. Well, the next question is, well, when are you going to leave? What time am I going to leave? Well, maybe that's dependent on an event. I need morning coffee, or maybe it's just because my husband says, hey, I'm going to go to the store. You want to come with me? Sure, I'll go. So let's say I get in my car, and there's a lot of different stores that I could choose to go to. So maybe I choose this store because it's really close to my house. Or maybe I choose a store that's a little bit further away, but I remember, hey, I need to go to the grocery store. So I'm going to choose this store because it's on the path in the end. Or maybe I choose this store that's over here because there's something special about the store. Maybe they're having a 20% off sale. And so I choose that store because it's special. Now, when I get to the store, let's say I decided I was going there to buy a yellow shirt because, of course, it's 20% off. But when I get there, I find an orange shirt that's 75% off. I might decide, hey, I'm going to choose and change my mind and choose to buy the orange shirt because it's a better deal. So I know this might not seem like it relates to metastases, but let's say we take all these things. Let's replace my house with the primary tumor. Let's replace the car with metastatic cells, or cells that like to spread. And let's replace all the locations I was going to go with places that cancer likes to spread to: the lungs, the lymph node, the brain, or the bone. And so the first question you might ask yourself is, will the primary tumor actually metastasize? That's dependent, again, on a lot of factors. What type of cancer is it? What about the stage and the grade of the cancer, or the internal DNA of those cells? So let's say, yes, we decide that the primary tumor is going to metastasize. Just like with the shopping analogy, the next question is, well, when will metastases occur? Well, this might be dependent on a lot of things. The size of the tumor, maybe there's a signal that cells send off that say, hey, it's time to metastasize, or maybe they just fall off. It's sort of opportunistic. They just kind of fall off and fall into the bloodstream. And so then you might ask, well, what site am I going to go to? Maybe I go to the lungs because it's relatively close to where I started. Maybe I go through the lymph nodes and end up in the brain because it's on that same path. Or maybe I go to the bone because there's something special about the bone that those cancer cells want. And just like when we were shopping, maybe the cancer cells went and had sort of one original idea to be these type of cells, but when they arrived there, there's a better deal. So they sort of switch their behavior. And you can imagine that this is a problem when we go to try to treat metastases, that the cells are not always the same as when we first started. So let's talk about the seed and soil theory. So this is a theory of how or why metastases occurs. So although metastases is really complicated, we know in some ways it's not random. So tumor cells, which are the seed, have an affinity for the environment, which is the soil of certain organs. And we think that metastases occurs when the seed plus the soil are actually compatible. So just like in this cartoon, you have a good seed, good soil, and you'll get a plant. Now, if you have a bad seed, even with good soil, you're not going to get a plant. And the opposite is true. If you have a good seed, but bad soil, you're still not going to get a plant. So this is the same way we think metastases works. If you have a breast cancer and you put it in the brain, it's going to form a brain metastases. Now, if I take that breast cancer cell and change it to a prostate cancer cell, you might assume that it would also form metastases, but in reality, there are very few prostate cancers that metastasize to the brain. So there's something important about the combination of both the cancer cell itself, or that seed, plus where it's going, which is the soil, and whether or not it's actually going to grow into a full metastases. So how do we study metastases in the lab? So I'm going to talk about two main ways that I often study to study metastases. And so one way is using cancer cell models. So just like you saw that video of the cells crawling in the Petri dish, we can culture or grow cancer cells in Petri dishes. And so one experiment, or one way that we often test cells for how they migrate or move, or how they can invade through a structure, is by using sort of this double chamber like this. And we'll put cells, which are the blue dots, on the top. And then we'll give those cells time. And what those cells will do over time is they'll pass through, or migrate through, or migrate down into the bottom half. And so what we're really interested in is studying these cells that actually migrate through. What's different about them? What has changed that allows them to move while the other cells didn't? Because we know migration is a foundational principle of metastases. And so what's really interesting about these experiments is we can often add drugs to these cells, or manipulate or change these cells in some way, and try to understand if our drugs or whatever manipulation we're doing is stopping them from migrating, or maybe it's helping them migrate. So we can really begin to understand sort of those foundations of metastases. The second way is using mouse models. And so one way you can do that is, if you have a mouse, you can put tumor cells into the mouse, and then you can ask, where do those tumor cells spread to? Where do they metastasize to? Then we can take those tumor cells out. And what I hope you can see from my cartoon is 2 of those cancer cells have now changed colors. So what we know is cells can often change their behavior after they've metastasized. So then we can take the tumor cells that we took out of the mouse, and we can actually re-put them back into the mouse and ask again, where did those tumor cells go? And we can do this in sort of a cyclical process over and over and over to try to understand, how are those cancer cells changing or behaving every time they metastasize? And hopefully what you can see at that very last tumor all the way on the far right is that there's actually only one cell that stayed the same color. And so what we know is that the cells will change their behavior. They'll change what they're turning on and turning off. They're changing the way they move every single time they metastasize. And so our job as scientists is to study the cells and how they're changing with each round of metastases. And we can also add drugs or manipulate the cells in different ways to try to understand, is that helping promote metastases? Are we causing metastases? Or maybe in the mouse, we can stop the cancer from metastasizing altogether. So that was a whole lot. I know it's probably a mouthful, so I want to review. So what we learned is cancer develops in stages. It doesn't happen overnight. Cells love to move. So those 2 things together, stages and movement, are the foundation of why metastases occurs. We talked about the metastatic process, how tumor cells can go into the bloodstream, travel the bloodstream, and then hop out at a different site and try to begin to grow a new tumor. And we know that this process is actually very complicated. But although it's complicated, it's not totally random. So the seed plus the soil is what's going to give you an actual growth of a metastases. And then there are very specific ways that we can study metastases in the lab using cancer cells and mice. So what is our ultimate goal with doing all of this research? We really want to understand the tumor itself. And we also want to understand the metastases. And there's actually a lot of work going on right now in cancer biology, including at Stanford, and even the work I do, to try to understand even the primary site. So what is that original soil, where the tumor came from before it even started traveling? Maybe that tells us something about why it's metastasizing. And so if we can understand this, we can begin to understand why tumors metastasize, when they metastasize, and how they metastasize. And the reason we want to have answers to this is, number one, for patient screening. Let's say all these patients have breast cancer. How do we identify that one patient that's going to get a brain tumor and start monitoring them early on so we can catch it, hopefully before it happens? And the second reason is for new treatments. If we can understand the cells themselves, or we can understand where the cells want to end up, we can begin to develop new treatments, new drugs to either stop or prevent that metastases altogether, or to help treat the metastases if it's already happened. And so the ultimate goal for all of the research that we do is that so that cancer patients can live longer, happier, healthier lives. And so with that, I will acknowledge both of my mentors who do awesome cancer research, the Science Cafe team, and most importantly, I want to acknowledge and thank all of the cancer patients, advocates, and their friends and family for being here today and continuing to fight that fight.
Just to introduce myself, my name is Minder Kaur. I am a neurology trained neuro-oncologist. So basically my focus is on brain cancer. And today we'll be discussing brain metastases. So Dr. Ume did a great presentation primarily talking about what does it mean to have metastatic disease, and I will focus more on what does it mean to have cancer in the brain itself. So what we will cover today, basically, we'll talk about what is brain mets. We'll talk a little bit about numbers. So essentially, how common is it? And, you know, in terms of the population, how many people can consider even getting brain cancer? We'll also talk about anatomy. It is very complex, so we'll try to break it down. So in terms of the anatomy, we're talking about the structure of the brain, which helps us as physicians to figure out exactly where the tumor is and which treatments will be helpful for the patient itself. So the complexity of the anatomy comes because the brain itself is connected to the spine. So we'll talk about how all of that kind of comes into play. We'll move forward from there to talk about how does it happen. I know Dr. Ume did a great job in terms of talking about how metastases develop, so I just delve into that very briefly. Then we'll talk about which cancers like going to the brain and why all of that matters. So just starting off with what does it mean to have brain mets? So basically brain mets means it's cancer that's gone from other parts of the body. So it could be the lung, the breast, or anywhere else in the body that's traveled to the brain and has kind of made the brain its home. So that's basically what we refer to when we talk about brain mets. So how common is it? So brain metastases, or secondary brain cancer, as we refer to it, is the most common type of brain cancer. It's actually very much more common than primary brain cancer, or cancer that develops in the brain itself. In terms of numbers, it's difficult to estimate because we don't have a nationwide reporting system in terms of brain mets, but it's thought to be roughly about 30 to 40,000 new patients yearly are diagnosed with brain mets. So if we're looking at an incidence in about 100,000 people, there's about 3 to about 7 people out of 100,000 who have cancer who will get brain mets. The incidence seems to be increasing, and that would make sense as we have better modalities of screening patients And we also have treatments that are prolonging survival. So because of those reasons, we see that there's more and more patients who are now presenting with brain mets. So let's delve right into it. So let's talk about the anatomy. I'll cover briefly the brain and the spinal cord anatomy and why it's important. I'll talk about the symptoms you can look for when there's concern for if you might have cancer that's in the brain or the spinal cord. And we'll talk about the last 2 points, the limitation of space as well as the blood-brain barrier as we progress in the talk. So starting with space limitation. So the best way I can explain this is if you think of a jar, think of a jar that's fully sealed and it's full of water. Into that jar, if you try introducing something new, something will have to give or displace if the jar is completely full and sealed. Similarly, in the brain, the skull encompasses the brain. The skull is a bony structure that's fully sealed. Within the skull, you have the brain, which is majority of the tissue, and you have the fluid, which is the CSF that cushions the brain around it to prevent any sort of damage to the brain. In addition, you also have blood. So if you're introducing anything extra into the skull outside of those 3 components, something will have to give. And when something gives is when we start seeing symptoms. So here you have an MRI of the brain. It's a cross section of the brain taken along the axial mode. And here I would like to just point out the structure that you see in the yellow. That's actually the cancer that's gone to the brain. And around it in the pink is the edema or the swelling. So this is a metastatic lesion gone from other part of the body to the brain. The important point for this slide that I wanted to make was, if you note along the right-hand corner, there is a darker colored circle. That should be symmetric and it should be on both sides. So because there's an introduction of a new lesion, it's pushing the brain and covering that ventricle on the left-hand side. So this is what we refer to as space limitation. And this is essentially what develops the symptoms, what presents with the symptoms when you start having these metastatic lesions in the brain. So what are the symptoms that we start looking for? So first, let's talk about the function of the brain. So you have the brain that's divided into lobes. You have the temporal lobe, you have the frontal, the parietal, and so forth. Won't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but I just want to point out that each lobe serves a certain function. So the front aspect of your brain, which is seen in the blue, that allows for movement of the eyes and it controls your personality. The structure that's in the yellow on the top of the brain, that's referred to as the parietal lobe, and it controls your sensory function. In the back of the brain, what we refer to as the occipital lobe, which is in the pink, it controls vision. On the bottom, we have the cerebellum, which controls the balance. And on the sides, actually, the lateral aspect, we have the temporal lobes, which control hearing and language. So all of this is important because this allows us to basically assess, 1, where the tumor would be, and 2, what the symptoms of the patient would be, and when the patient's getting better, because those symptoms would start to somewhat resolve. Just keep that slide in your back pocket. We will be referring back to it eventually. But here I want to kind of pivot to what happens within the brain itself if the cancer has gone to the brain. So once the cancer has traveled to the brain, it can now travel within the brain also. And the way it does this is via 2 mechanisms. One is it can kind of jump onto the ventricular system. So now the ventricular system here is pointed, it's the blue aspect, and this is basically just the fluid that's in the brain. The fluid in the brain encompasses all around the brain, it's within the brain, and it goes along your spinal cord as well. So if those cancer cells that are now within the brain tissue itself escape the tissue and get into the CSF or the fluid, they can kind of travel along that path and end up down in the spinal cord. Additionally, the same pathway is covered by what we call the leptomeninges, or the covering of the brain. It's kind of like a sheet of paper that kind of covers all along the brain. So if a cancer cells jump onto that sheet, it can again similarly travel that path and end up in the spinal cord. Why is that important? Because when the cancer is in the spinal cord, it will also present with different symptoms. So again, the spinal cord is also divided, and I'm sure you've heard these names in the past: cervical, thoracic, lumbar. So where the cancer is in the spinal cord will help us assess, one, what symptoms the patient is having, and two, how we're going to treat it. And additionally, when we're concerned that there's cancer in the spinal cord, we might even test them differently. We might have to do a lumbar puncture, for example, or image the spine at, with different modalities. So in terms of the spinal cord, when there is cancer there, if we're concerned that it's in the cervical spine, the patient might have head or neck symptoms, where there's weakness in the head or other symptoms concerning with the nerves in the head or the neck. The diaphragm can be involved because that the nerve that controls the diaphragm comes down from there, and that can have issues with the breathing. Your arms and your hands are also controlled with the nerves in the cervical spine. Further, thoracic tumors basically involve muscles of the chest and the abdominal muscles. And the lumbar, going further down, they control the muscles in the legs. So if there's involvement in any part of the brain, we can kind of figure out which part might be involved based on what the concerns of the patient are. Lastly, the sacrum involves the control of the bowel and the bladder. And again, if you present with those symptoms, that might be our main concern. Of course, it's never cookie cutter or straightforward, but this kind of gives you an idea. I would like to mention here that when the cancer goes to the spinal cord itself, not essentially from traveling down from the brain, but if its primary site is the spinal cord, it likes going to the bone first and not the spinal cord itself. So the spinal cord is surrounded by what we call vertebral bodies. If the cancer goes to the bony aspect first, you might just present with back pain and no other symptom until it continues to grow and push on the spinal cord and present with one of these symptoms that are on the screen. All right, so going back to that initial slide that we talked about with the involvement of the brain. So again, based on the region, we will have different symptoms in the brain. So what does that mean? So if the front of the brain is involved, like we mentioned, your vision or your personality might be involved. So what are the symptoms that you might come in with? You might complain of double vision, that you're not seeing right because the eyes are not moving properly. You might have personality changes where it can be as subtle as, hey doc, I feel like I can't concentrate on things like I used to. I can't do my work like I was able to previously. It can be as subtle, or family members might complain that they're not acting like themselves. They're very forgetful, or you're not even able to navigate around your house. So something as severe as that can also be the initial presentation. In terms of sensory, what are we talking about? So in terms of sensory, your symptoms might be numbness. Very rarely does cancer or anything involving the brain actually will present with pain as a sensation. You might have a headache, but not a pain in one part of the body. You'll present with loss of sensation, which is numbness. So you might come in with complaints of heaviness, or feeling like you had anesthesia given to one part of the body. In terms of if there's cancer in the back of the brain, your vision might be affected. So what might be the complaints? You just might complain that things just feel fuzzy. You feel out of focus. You might complain that there is a visual field cut. There's one piece on the visual field that's missing, or it might be as frank as blindness. When the balance part of the brain is involved, there's concern with unsteady gait. So you have difficulty walking because you just feel wobbly. You might feel like you're walking on stones, or you feel like you're falling to one side more than the other. And lastly, when the part of the brain that controls hearing and language is involved, You might have trouble hearing, you might have trouble speaking, or you just might have trouble understanding or even reading or writing language. So it can be any one piece of that. Sometimes when this part is involved, patients generally complain of trouble focusing at work where they're not able to read things or get through things as fast. So why is all that important? Not everybody presents the same way. Headache is thought to be the most common symptom. And this is one study that was done not too long ago, and they found that headache is actually not as common of a feature as was previously thought. And the reason is because the cancer that's going to the brain, these metastatic lesions, they're not very big. They eventually grow, but initial presentation is not very big. As they slowly grow, they cause swelling, and that's what causes the irritation to cause the headaches. But you might have other complaints. And again, the symptoms will vary based on the region, but the changes might be as subtle as just a mental status change. And what that means is you're just not feeling like yourself. It can be weakness, like we mentioned, if one part of the body is involved, where it controls your motor function, you might feel a heaviness in that part of the body, or you might have trouble with fine motor movement and so forth. So the point of this slide is basically if you feel or if anybody feels like something is off, it's always best to bring it to the physician's attention. So what do we see when we are looking at brain cancer? These are basically images of the brain, and we're looking at MRIs at this time. I wanted to just give you an idea of what exactly does it look like when we're evaluating metastatic disease. So starting with the left-hand corner, lower left, this is what we refer to as a brain parenchyma or actual brain tissue. So as you can see, there are 3 white lesions, and the 3 white lesions are basically the tumors that are now picking up contrast. Contrast is the dye that's given to you, and that this helps highlight the tumors in the brain and helps us assess them. Around the white lesions, you see the darkness, and that darkness is basically swelling. The swelling aspect is what essentially causes a lot of the symptoms in the beginning because it takes up a lot more space, like we talked about in the beginning. And when something is taking up space, it's pushing aside normal tissue, and that is what will cause the symptoms. And the B, you will see what we call the involvement of the ventricles. So you might recall ventricles are what holds the spinal fluid or the brain fluid. If you look at C, right in the center, you see the 2 ventricles, and that's what normal ventricles look like. Now comparing B to C, you can see the difference on the B slide where there is cancer now growing in those ventricles. And lastly, going back to C slide, the meninges here are involved. So the meninges are, remember, the covering of the brain that we refer to, the sheet that kind of covers it. So those little white specks that you see that are kind of going into the brain, that's the covering, but now it's kind of layered with the cancer cells. So it can be as thin as that. So we have to be very observant when we're looking for the subtle signs that can be involving the brain in terms of brain mets. So how does it all happen? Dr. Ume did a fantastic job in covering this. So keeping in consideration of the time, I will come back to this if we have time at the end. But there are other things I would want to bring to your attention, and this includes basically the common cancers. So which cancers like going to the brain? Essentially, any type of cancer can spread to the brain, but there's certain types of cancers that are more likely to go to the brain than others. And these include lung cancer, breast cancer, melanoma, colon cancer, and kidney cancer. If you look at the numbers on the right-hand side, lung cancer seems to be the most prevalent, followed by breast, then melanoma, and then other. So just to further kind of categorize within this, not every type of lung cancer likes going to the brain. There are subcategories within lung cancer. So to give you an example, say if you were to go to a concert and you've pre-booked your tickets, you have your tickets in hand, And nowadays, you need your COVID vaccination card in hand. You have both of them handy, you come to the concert door, you flash both of them, they let you right in. And compared to another person who might have one or the other, don't have the tickets or don't have the vaccination card, they will have to wait their turn, or they might not be allowed in at all. Similarly, in lung cancer or breast cancer or melanoma, there are subcategories where the cancer cells have certain signals. If they don't have those signals activated, those cancer cells will not be allowed into the brain. So within lung cancer, there are certain cancers that have those signals on ready to go, and they get right into the brain and they flourish within the brain tissue compared to others who won't ever get in. So why does this all matter? And the most important piece of information here is this, this slide coming up, which is talking about the blood-brain barrier. So how do things get into the brain? We understand that everything that gets into the brain is through the bloodstream. So you have your arteries that carry blood into the brain, and from the bloodstream, things get right into the brain. So think of the brain as a gated community, and it doesn't like things just coming right in. There is a very tight control of what gets into the brain, and this is what we refer to as a tight junction. So any substance that's introduced into the blood does not automatically end up in the brain. This is a main concern for us as clinicians, because this is where the treatment is affected. Anytime we're giving chemotherapy or immunotherapy to patients, this is the barrier that we have to overcome. The brain is a very coveted organ, and it does not like things coming into it. So this is essentially the main thing we have to surpass when we're talking about treatments. Now let's pivot back into why does this all matter? Prevention. So in terms of the cancers that we talked about, not everybody gets screened. And why doesn't everybody get screened? Well, we initially talked about the numbers. The numbers are pretty rare in terms of the people that get brain mets. So if not everybody gets brain mets, not every person who has cancer needs to be screened. So then we have to break it down. Well, which cancers like going to the brain? And within those cancers, what are the subcategories that really, really like going to the brain? And those are the patients who will essentially be followed very closely with imaging to make sure that they're not developing cancer in the brain, or we're catching it early. In addition to that, a lot of times you'll see screening as part of clinical trials. So all of this we'll get into more detail in our next series of talks, I guess part B of this continued metastatic disease talk. In addition to this, why does this all matter? Well, it all matters also because of treatment. So preventative aspect, another treatment aspect. How are we treating these patients? Every cancer is treated differently. Every subcategory of cancer is treated differently. So we have the standard of care, which might allow us surgical options. Surgical options will vary based on where the cancer is in the brain. If the cancer is deep within the brain, surgery might not be an option. Then we talk about radiation. Radiation might not be an option for certain types of cancers like kidney cancer or colon cancer in the brain, because they're not radiosensitive or they don't respond to radiation. Then we talk about chemotherapy or immunotherapy. Well, we just talked about the blood-brain barrier. We have to consider, well, is this drug going to get past that barrier into the brain to even have any effect? Because remember, every treatment comes with side effects. So we want to make sure we're not giving the side effects to our patient without any benefit. So all of these things have to come into consideration. And once we've kind of exhausted all those options, then we consider clinical trials. Well, in clinical trials, what does it mean? Who is eligible? What options are there? Because of the consideration of time, we will save all of this discussion for our the next date when we'll be covering this topic. But kind of just wanted to bring this to your attention, as this is kind of what we all build up to. And I believe this is the end of my talk. I want to thank you so much for your attention. And it's really been a privilege to be able to have this discussion with all of you. Now, I will leave you with this last thought here, that the brain is the most important organ you have. And again, of course, this is according to the brain. And we will open the floor for